Hi there and welcome to Pearced Off with Jonathan M.S. Pearce, a tippling philosopher. So this week I'm going to be talking about a paper by Stephen Maitzen that is called Ordinary Morality Implies Atheism, which basically is a paper that looks at the fact that morality as we know it in society is underwritten by atheism, not theism. So the belief in God is not needed at all to define some understanding of morality. So I don't really want to talk through or go through every single proposition of this argument, but I will just look at it basically and have a look at one aspect of it. And the argument is based on this particular proposition that necessarily God permits undeserved involuntary human suffering only if such suffering ultimately produces a net benefit for the sufferer. So this is the problem of evil, and the problem of evil, theists get around this with the logical defense of the problem of evil, which says that any kind of suffering in the world can be understood in the context of a greater good. So there must be a reason why they're suffering, even though we might not know what it is. So this is a fairly basic understanding of the problem of evil. So if we accept that suffering exists and an all-powerful God exists, then we kind of have to accept that there must be a net benefit for the sufferer. So if a small child gets cancer and dies at the age of 2, there must be a net benefit for that sufferer. It must be for that sufferer because if that child is being used as a pawn for someone else's net benefit, then that in a Kantian sense, God is using that child as a means to an end, which is kind of not really permissible in an understanding of what God's morality or moral dimension might be. So God can't really use people as pawns for the benefit of others. That seems, intuitively fairly unfair. Certainly in deontology, in this kind of objective morality, moral obligations, moral laws, categorical imperatives that someone like Immanuel Kant spelt out. So the other problem is that we can't, or theists can't, use heaven as morally justifying suffering. So, for example, if you say a 2-year-old suffers horribly with cancer and then dies, it's very difficult to say, well, that's all fine because that 2-year-old has an eternity in heaven, because that, although that may be compensation, that doesn't justify that act. I think I've talked about that on Pearced Off before. The idea that if I walked up to someone and punched them in the face in the street and then gave them £10,000, that £10,000 is a compensation, but it doesn't morally justify the action of punching the person in the face, which is to say that it doesn't make it a good action in and of itself. It compensates that action, that bad action, it compensates it, but doesn't turn that bad action into a good action. So this idea that this argument is based on necessarily God permits undeserved involuntary human suffering only if such suffering ultimately produces a net benefit for the sufferer seems pretty much fairly solid to me. Now I just want to look at one aspect of this argument, so I'm going to talk you through just a couple of premises and sort of stop there. So if God exists and this premise that I've just mentioned is true, then necessarily all undeserved involuntary human suffering ultimately produces a net benefit for the sufferer. So that's a proposition that says that statement I said earlier is true, but also God exists is true. Now, if necessarily all undeserved involuntary human suffering ultimately produces a net benefit for the sufferer, then we've got two sort of sub-conclusions or sub-propositions that follow from that. Either A, we never have a moral obligation to prevent undeserved involuntary suffering, or B, our moral obligation to prevent undeserved involuntary human suffering derives entirely from God's commands. Now, I want to look at A here because I think it's really, really interesting. So we can forget B because our ordinary morality doesn't derive from God's direct commands or to God's commands. Like ordinarily, I think we can do away with that that proposition, because on a day-to-day basis, and even in the animal kingdom, basic ordinary morality can be seen to be derived not from God's commands. But I want to look very quickly at this idea that we never have a moral obligation to prevent undeserved involuntary human suffering. Now, what this means is that if I see someone, Jim, for example, he's being beaten up on the street by two muggers. And I see Jim, and I've got this kind of intuitive moral obligation to step in there and save him. Now, if I choose not to save him, or even if I didn't exist, so Jim is just beaten up by two people, there has to be a scenario whereby God creates a moral benefit for Jim. Sorry, not a moral benefit, where God creates a net benefit for Jim. That means that if he is beaten up and it's totally unfair and he's just mugged and beaten within an inch of his life or even killed, there must be some kind of greater good that comes out of that. Otherwise, God is not all good. And he's allowing gratuitous evil. So that evil, that suffering, cannot be gratuitous. Now, that's a fallback. God has to have that kind of fail-safe of a greater good for Jim. Now, given that Jim has this greater good that comes out of him being beaten up, if I then see him being beaten up, by stopping him being beaten up, by stepping in and saying, hey guys, this is completely unfair, and actually doing what we would ordinarily see as a morally obliged thing to do, actually I'm stopping Jim from accessing this greater good. So Stephen Maitzen in his paper looks at the analogy that a child or anyone might have an inoculation, a vaccination against a very painful disease, and that disease is debilitating. But the painful vaccination, which might give you 3 or 4 days of pain in the arm, suffering as you inject the person, brings about a greater good for that person. But we're not morally obliged to stop that injection, that pain, that suffering of the initial injection, because there's a greater good that comes out of it. Well, surely this is exactly analogous to Jim being beaten up on the road. I shouldn't stop that initial pain of him being beaten up on the road, because a greater good will come of it. God assures this, otherwise it's gratuitous, and he's not omnibenevolent and not omnipotent. So actually, am I not morally obliged not to step in there? In fact, am I morally obliged not to stop any suffering in the world? Because there must be a fail-safe of a net benefit for all the people that suffer, if God is omnibenevolent. So I think this is a really interesting argument that shows the incoherence, obviously, of God and suffering and the problem of evil, but it looks at the action of people that might want to do what we see as ordinarily morally good actions, but in reality they are preventing a greater good coming about by doing those good actions. So we, in the same way that we would not be morally obliged to stop vaccinations from taking place because they create a greater good, we are also obliged not to stop suffering in the world, which must be necessary for a net benefit to the sufferer. Anyway, that's something of interest to talk about. I didn't deal with the whole argument there, but just that interesting aspect of Stephen Maitzen's argument. Check it out online. It's a free paper that's online, very well worth reading. I think it's a really good, interesting philosophical paper on the problem of evil. As ever, question everything, and please drop by my blog at Tippling Philosopher. Until next time, goodbye.